Okay. Cooperative Legacy Project interview number 60. December 14th, 2006. We're visiting with Scott Parsley, East River Electric Power Cooperative, Assistant General Manager for Member Services. That's a mouthful. Scott, where and when were you born?
Well, Chuck, I was born in Brookings, South Dakota in 1952, October 22nd to be exact. I grew up on a farm just south of Brookings, a dairy farm.
Okay. And what was your father's name?
Ralph.
What is your father's name?
My father passed away 20 years ago this past January, and his name is Ralph L. Parsley. Ralph Leo Parsley.
You want to talk about him a little bit? What
Sure.
kind of person was he?
Well, he was the oldest of 8 kids. Grew up on a farm just into Moody County, south of Brookings. He was a product of the 2-year agricultural school that South Dakota State had back in the 40s, early 40s. Shortly after he graduated from the ag program, he was drafted in World War II, served in the Philippines and Okinawa, and was wounded about 3 months before the war was over, and spent the last 3 months in the hospital, and then a few months after the war was over in the hospital. Came back to South Dakota after the war, and his brother-in-law, my mother's brother, was just beginning to wire farms because rural electrification was being re-energized again after the war, and he invited my father to work with him, and so they wired a lot of farm places in Brookings County. Then in 1950, my father and another man, a man by the name of Bill Clark, started Parsley Clark Electric. And my dad always said that he wired probably about 75% of the rural farms in Brookings County when Central Station electricity first became available. His partner bought a farm as they did the electrical business together, and about a year and a half after they started their business in 1950, he died of a heart attack. His partner did. His partner's wife wanted to sell the farm, so my dad and mother bought that farm, and that's the farm I was born and raised on. They moved on that farm in February of 1952, and I was born in October of 1952. We had a dairy farm and a diversified farm. We had hogs and sheep and milk cows, and we milked about 45 or 50 cows, so in those days it was a pretty good size dairy. I'm one of 8 kids. I have 6 sisters and 1 brother, and I'm right in the middle.
Recite their names?
Oh, yeah. We're all S's. Susan, Stephana, Sheila, Scott, Stephen, Stacia, Sharon, and Sean, and that's the order from...
I don't know if I've ever heard of an S family.
oldest to youngest. That's the order.
Okay.
So we had a pretty good built-in labor force right there on the farm. My dad continued, besides farming, to operate Parsley Electric for a number of years, and he was a hard-working guy. We were a good Irish family. My mother was a Sutton from the Flandreau Sutton group, and so she actually grew up on what they call today the S-curves south of Brookings on Old 77. When I was growing up, that was called the Sutton Curve, because that farm that still is there today, it's now Porter's Bait Farm, was where my grandparents lived. And my mother graduated from Brookings High School. But my father was a good, solid prairie populist, good Democrat, many times over the chair of the Brookings County Democrats, and oftentimes, if he wasn't, my mother was, and so I was brought into politics at a very early age. In fact, the first campaign I can remember working on, I can remember a little bit of the Kennedy campaign, but for sure the Johnson campaign for president. I can remember walking up and down Main Street in Brookings and handing out flyers, and so my dad was very involved, and my folks were both very involved in those types of civic activities, and so.
Okay. As a lot of people do, you already answered some of my other questions there. And you said you were Irish. This is my Irish trip. The guy I interviewed yesterday was Irish, too.
Yeah, well, I'm 100% Irish. In fact, we went back in 1991 4 of my 6 sisters, my brother and my mother and I went back to Ireland, and one of her cousins had done a lot of things on her side of the family, and we found everything we looked for. Her grandmother, or her mother, my grandmother, was a Kavanagh, and my father's mother was a Fargen. So there's
related to the Fargens at
Flandre. Yeah, yeah. She was one of the Flandre Fargens, and so that's, you can find Parsley, Fargen, Sutton, and Kavanagh names all over in Ireland. So that was a good trip.
Okay. When you were young, what did you want to do? Did you want to farm? You were on a farm. Were you kind of pushed in that direction or pushed away from it, like a lot of kids are?
I guess I would say I was more discouraged to farm than I was encouraged. We grew up on, the farm I grew up on is right in the Sioux River bottom, and we would have a good crop about once every 7 years. In June, our corn would be yellow because it would be so wet, and in August it would be brown because it would be burned up. It was all sand. But in 1968, I was junior in high school. We sold the dairy cows, and my dad actually, he farmed a little bit, but rented most of the land out, and he got his union card and became a union electrician at that time. And in the mid-'60s, it was a struggle on the farm. In fact, in '65, my dad had been offered and almost took a job at Boeing out in Seattle. I had a couple uncles that were working out there. But in the final analysis, my folks just said they weren't moving 8 kids out to Seattle. They were going to stay where they were. And as I look back, I remember we talked about that a lot as a family, and it was kind of exciting, but at the same time, it was kind of scary. And as I look back, I'm glad they stayed where they were. My mother still lives on the farm I grew up on, and she's 83 and has a home-based business and makes draperies and climbs ladders and hangs them, and she just has a great time. And she's 2.5 miles out in the country and probably has 20 people at her house every day just to see what she's doing and talk. And so she's been in that community all of her life and is well known, and it's a good place for her to be.
Okay. Where did you go to school at?
I went to high school in Brookings. Actually, I went 6 years at country school at District 88 Country School in Brookings County.
What was that like?
Well, some years I was the only one in my class. I think the largest number in my class was 4. One year we had 4. But
you're probably part of the last generation, at least in the eastern part of the state, to go to country school.
I went 6 years, and then my older sisters, had gone 8 years to country school. When I was in the 6th grade, it was the year that we did a partial reorganization. What happened was, then in my 7th grade, I went to junior high in town, but we had another country school. We had one country school a half mile west, District 88, where we went. District 87 was a half a mile east of us, and that school physically had a much bigger building than our building. So they closed our building and another one a little further west of us and put the kids in District 87 for about 2 years, and then Brookings County totally disbanded the country school program. Mm-hmm. I went to junior high in Brookings, high school in Brookings, and graduated in 1970. Went into the military in February of 1971 in the Navy. And so I was a non-traditional student. I had been out of school for 7 years when I went to college. And I had come home and did farm for a little while. My dad and I raised some hogs, and I was the labor and he was the money. And we wound up with, we decided to do some custom farrowing for a fella, and he had some disease in his hogs that we didn't know about, and it got in our hogs, and it kind of wiped us out. And so then I was able to, under what the union calls a white card, do some electrical work. I'd worked with my dad for a long time in the electrical business, and I worked on the power plant at Big Stone, the first Big Stone 1, and then did some work at 3M as they were building there as well. In that in that period, then I married my wife Val. She had graduated from South Dakota State and was teaching in Millbank High School. And Val Lind, and she was from Salem, and her folks were very active in the Farmers Union, Bob and Evelyn Lind, and again, another good Prairie populist family, good Democrats. We try to stick together. There's not that many of us around. So, but we got married, and I decided that I needed to use the GI Bill, or I was going to lose it. So I actually went to school at South Dakota State. I began in the summer, and went that summer and the next year. And my wife worked on her master's during the school year in English, and she decided after 1 year of working on her master's that she wanted to get back into teaching. So I just said, well, get a job where I can keep going to school. And she had a job offer in Arlington, South Dakota, and Sioux Center, Iowa. The difference in pay was about twice as much in Iowa. And so she took that job, and I was, at that time, thought about driving over to Vermilion. It's about 50 miles, and going to school over there. Got to Sioux Center. Dort College is located at Sioux Center. It's quite a bit more expensive, but I had the GI Bill, so I was able to, and they had some programs for veterans. And so I actually graduated from Dort College with a political science degree. In 1979, I graduated from Dort.
All right. So. Let's go back just a little bit. You mentioned you were in the Navy. Where were you at when you were in the Navy?
Well, I left here and I went to Great Lakes to boot camp, and in February.
February of
1971. So if you want
to... was still going then.
Vietnam, it was Vietnam era. Yeah. So my dad had told my brother and I both to not get drafted, but to enlist in the Navy because we would always have warm food and a dry bed. He was drafted in World War II and spent most of his time in a foxhole. And he had seen combat firsthand and did not want, if we could avoid it, did not want his sons to do that. So both my brother and I enlisted in the Navy. My brother was in the Seabees. He's a year and a half younger than I am. But I went to Great Lakes in February. The routine was you hand washed your clothes, you took them out and hung them outside on the line, and they froze dry. It would snow as the lake affects snow, and 2 o'clock in the morning we'd get up and shovel snow, not to shovel anything out or open any roads, just to shovel snow, and that was part of the training. So it was kind of a cold place to be in the middle of the winter, but got through that, and then went to Millington, actually, Tennessee, which is just outside of Memphis, to aviation fuels school. And after that, then I was assigned to the John F. Kennedy aircraft carrier, and in aviation fuels. Kind of an interesting story. I came on board the ship. It was not in dry dock, but it was in dock, having some repairs, just general maintenance done on it. And so I arrived at about, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night in this great big ship, and I'm a farm kid from South Dakota. I've never even seen an ocean, let alone being on a big ship like this. And you walk in, and there's torches burning and sparks flying, and they're welding and doing all kinds of stuff just on normal repair. And, of course, you can't find your way around anyhow. And they take me to my bunk, and I kind of grab a hold of that for a security blanket and hang on for the night. And the next day we got up and went down. They started showing me around, and they took me down as far down as you can go in a ship, and that's where the pumping station for the fuels, aviation fuels, is, for the jet fuels for the aircraft. And we walked in there, and I said, you got a D-LaBelle cream separator in here. And the guy said, do you know what that is? And I said, well, yeah, it looks just like, actually it was made by D-LaBelle, but it was about 10 times as large as the cream separator on the farm, and it had 35,000 RPMs. And all of the fuel that came on board, fuel when it gets moved from tank to tank, gets moved out of the tank on land to the tank ship, from the tank ship into the carrier, you pick up water. So we had to purify all that fuel. We had to run it through the cream separator or the centrifuge and spin the water off. And so when they found out I knew what that was, then I worked down in the bottom of the ship for about a year. And then after that, I went up on flight deck and pulled hose for a while and fueled aircraft. And actually, in the end, I was sitting next to the flight ops officer in the flight deck control in the big crow's nest you see on a carrier. And when they would spot the airplanes, then I would dispatch the fueling crews to have them go out and fuel the airplanes. So that's what I did when I was in the Navy.
Okay. Kids. You got kids?
Actually, I have 3 kids.
3
Yeah.
Okay.
Our son is 20. He is right now a sophomore at USD.
Yeah.
Will be transferring in January to the University of Minnesota. He wants to pursue a degree in sports studies, and that would lead to either sport event planning or working for a sports team in a lot of different areas. So he's very interested in that, and a good student, does well. Our second child is a daughter, and she's 17. She's a senior at Madison. She just completed about 5 months in Germany. She did an exchange program in Germany and spent the last semester of her junior year in a German high school.
Okay, how is it to send your 17-year-old off to Germany for 5 months? Was it more traumatic for your wife than you?
Well, it was the good part about it was my wife and I have both lived in Germany together. We lived there together. My wife was an exchange teacher, so we've had the experience. The family she lived with, their daughter had lived with us for a year and a half prior to that. Kate had been over there and visited them when she went back. And in 2003, our whole family had been over there, and the people we lived with when we were there still live in the same place, and so we go visit them, and that's actually only about 20 miles from where our daughter lived. So we were, certainly you're a little apprehensive about those things, but we were pretty comfortable in that we knew the people she was going to be living with, and she had 2.5 years of German before she went, so she was, could read the language, and speaking is just a matter of getting there and doing it, and so she did very well. She did very well. She's back now, finishing her high school year this year. She'll be done in May, and she's been accepted at San Francisco State College right now, and has also applied at the University of Minnesota, and I would guess will get accepted up there, and then she'll have to make some decisions about where she wants to go to school. She does definitely want to go to a larger city. She wants to get out of South Dakota to go to college. And then we have an 11-year-old, a 6th grader. And my wife is the high school principal at Rutland High School, and she also teaches some classes up there. The administration in Rutland and in many small schools, not only is the administrator, but they teach. The superintendent actually teaches a class as well, and he likes that. I mean, they both like that very much because they're both classroom people, and they didn't want to walk away from that totally. Yeah. But our youngest goes to school in Rutland with her then, and open enrolls up there. So that works out very well for us. So those are our 3 kids. Our youngest is Chinese, and our other 2 are Korean.
Oh, so. Okay. All right. I guess then we need to pick things up. You had gotten your political science degree, and then you mentioned living in Germany. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about that?
Yeah.
About your experiences in Germany?
Well, actually, was
that immediately after you graduated?
Right. I graduated in the spring of 1979, and I worked for a large farmer in the Sioux Center area by the name of Wilmer Rensink. Wilmer went on to become the Senate Majority Leader in Iowa after I had worked for him. At the time I worked for him, he served on several national boards, mostly dealing with in the cattle industry. So to say I ran his farm would probably be an exaggeration because he did make all the decisions, but he was gone a lot, and I was the only hired person that he had. So he did have a younger boy who was about 13 at the time I was there, and he helped a lot. I mean, we worked together well. So I managed that farm for Wilmer for about a year and a half, and then my wife had the opportunity. She was teaching high school in Sioux Center. She was a German and English teacher. Had the opportunity, had applied for a Fulbright teacher exchange scholarship. There were 21 of them awarded nationally that year, and she received one of them. And the school she taught in was a very diverse school. The town that she taught in is called Espelkamp. Mm-hmm. It was built after World War II as a resettlement site for German Russians that were being expelled from Russia. They had German heritage, but they lived 3 or 4 generations in Russia. But after the war, the Russians were so distraught with the Germans, they made them leave. And that's where a lot of our Hutterite community came from. Same type of thing.
And Mennonites as well.
And Mennonites as well. And let me just see who this is. Oop, that's my mother. I'll talk to her in a little bit. So they came back to this community. That Espelkamp had been a munitions factory for the Germans during World War II, and the Allies knew it was there, but it was in a very heavily treed area. The Germans had concentration camps or prisoner of war camps, and they had surrounded the community with these camps. So the Allies didn't want to bomb it because they didn't want to kill any of the people in the camps. So the intelligence had told them all this stuff. So after the war, they had all these buildings that were available because so much of Germany was destroyed that they created the town of Espelkamp. There were actually 3 towns created after World War II as resettlement places for these exile. Most of these people came and they spoke Russian. I mean, they didn't. As a result, then Espelkamp has about 13 different nationalities. When we lived there were a lot of Pakistani, a lot of Turkish people, the Russian, German Russians, just all kind. I mean, you could walk down the street and hear 5 different languages in a block. It was really an interesting community. That's where my wife taught. And she taught in a gymnasium, which is the college preparatory school. So she taught the kids that were, most motivated and probably some of the smarter kids around. And then we lived in a small old village called Egenstedt with the family we lived with, and this was a old village. The church in the next town over had a date of 1125 on it, so I mean it was an old community. And what I did, and I'm safe now, I think the statute of limitation has run out. I was what they call a Schwarzarbeiter, or a non-permitted worker. I didn't have a green card, and I worked for a man that had an antique furniture business. And I did some work in the building, or with the furniture, although I'm not a great craftsman. He had some great craftsmen that worked for him. He had a little drinking problem and lost his license while I was there, so I wound up getting to travel all over Germany delivering furniture and doing those kinds of things. So I really got to see a lot of the country, and of course my wife and I traveled whenever we could.
Of course, at this point we're talking about what used to be known as West Germany.
Right, we were in West Germany. We did get into Berlin several times during the year, and that was an interesting experience every time you'd cross the border. I never, even though we owned a car, I never drove to Berlin because there were always horror stories of having to, as soon as you get across the border, you'll get picked up because you got to pay your entrance fee and then get hassled a little bit. So we always took the train in. In 1993 was the first time, actually, that I ever drove in what was the old East Germany. Very interesting as you cross where the border was. I mean, there are still remnants of fences and guardhouses and stuff. Of course, they're all open, but it's an interesting experience. So that was a great year for us. We made some great friendships. My wife, of course, as a German teacher, was fluent when we went. I didn't speak any German when we went, and now I can speak German, so that's good. And we go back quite often. We've probably been back since 81, probably 7 or 8 times. So we try and get there every 3 years or so.
Yeah, okay. So you get back over here. What happens then? Well,
we came back, and I went to work for Keystone Treatment Center in Canton, South Dakota. It's an alcohol and drug treatment center. They were working with a lot of the community counseling.
For going for all different kinds of unrelated work.
There's a reason that I worked there. It's because I'd gone through there as a patient before we went to Germany. So, and I had a relationship there. They were trying to develop an outreach program where they would go out and work with community counseling centers that had patients who were in need of our clients who are in need of inpatient treatment facilities, and so we would try and develop relationships with them in the Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota area. So I spent a lot of time on the road just out doing public relations for them. Did that for a period of time. We got back in August, and I started there in September. While we were gone, the school my wife had been in, and it was an exchange program, so a teacher from Germany came over and taught where she was at, with the understanding that you would go back to those schools. Well, they had a change of administration while we were gone, and we got notice that my wife would not have a job when she got back. So from a long-distance standpoint, we wrote some letters and talked to school board members and stuff and reminded them that the understanding had been they would let her go, but she had to guarantee that she would come back for at least a year so that they would get some benefit out of the opportunity that they were making available. And she reminded them of that, and they said, you're right. So she did actually, could have probably stayed too, but it was kind of left a feeling of, I'm not so sure if I wanted here. So the plan had been that we would try and find something different for her after that year. As that happened, we were interested in getting back to South Dakota. We were living in Sioux Center, Iowa at that time. And a position opened at what is called Every Citizen Counts organization. It's a program in Madison that works with developmentally disabled adults in a community workshop setting. The position of assistant manager or assistant executive of that organization was open, and I applied and was hired. So I actually moved to Madison in March of 1982, and my wife followed in June when school was out down there. And we've been here. I worked there for just about 5 years, and then the position of economic development specialist opened up here at East River, which was a brand new position. They had never done anything like that before. And again, the purpose was to do outreach. How could we assist in economic development in the state, and not only in South Dakota, but western Minnesota, where we also serve electrically. With my work at Keystone, where I'd done a lot of outreach work, and with my work at the Adjustment Training Center, I was in charge of our production and finding things to do and working with industry to see if we could do parts work and those kinds of things. I had a lot of those relationships developed already, and so I was hired. In 1986, January of 86, I began. Actually, interestingly enough, I had an interview in December, was offered the job, and was going to start on January 13th of 1986, and that was the day that we buried my father. I had spent the day with him on the 7th, and that was a Wednesday, and on Friday the 10th, about 11:30 or 12 o'clock, I got a call from my mother, I guess it was about 2 o'clock, saying she was at the hospital in Brookings and that my father had just passed away. And so he had a heart attack. And so the day and actually East Rivers, as they are always very gracious in those things, said, your start date is still the 13th of January, even though you won't be here. So I physically didn't arrive until the 16th of January. I had 3 days of bereavement leave before I got started. So,
so when you get into the new job here, what kind of things were you dealing with at that time?
Well, I was trying to set up the whole area of how this organization could assist our distribution cooperatives who own us in being involved in economic development in their areas. And the first thing that we did, we, through our G&T, an organization that we're part owners of, Basin Electric, they were also moving in that direction. This was kind of a general movement at that time. And we had a lady from Arizona coming up to Basin in Bismarck to do some training on how to assist communities in identifying their strengths and weaknesses and putting together kind of an economic development plan for themselves. And I wasn't on the job 4 days, and I was at Bismarck and going through that training. And so then we provided that service for, in the first year I was here, for probably about 18 communities. And this was a commitment of about 2 weeks of, not just 2 weeks straight, but over the course of time, about 2 weeks of coming together as a community, doing an assessment of the community, meeting, discussing strengths and weaknesses, discussing ideas about where the people would like to see the community go, and then developing an economic development plan from that. We actually did that for about 5 years. We offered that service for communities. After about a year, I switched jobs within the organization, and that was probably the biggest thing that we got going then. But I was also just going through some papers the other day, and in early 1987, I had put together kind of a white paper on how we might develop a revolving loan fund. And finally, in 1996, the person who was in the position that I had in 1986 figured out how to get that done, and she got
Linda
Salmonson, what is now the READ loan program. We got that all put together. So those things sometimes take a while to grow, but you plant the seed, and they eventually happen. So.
Yeah. When did East River first get involved in value-added agriculture?
About that time. I mean, 1986 is when we were beginning the discussions of all those things. Yeah. Probably in 1987 is when Broynes bought the Scotland plant, and that
we had 6 or 7 years or 8 years of discussion of ethanol, but
right.
We really have not produced anything.
Right. And that was kind of one of the first things was, and the other thing that we did, a couple of the specific value-added things that we got involved in the first year that I was here was we helped form a vegetable growing cooperative, and there was a group of people around Esteline that grew onions, some carrots, a lot of broccoli, a lot of cauliflower. Actually, they did fairly well. They put a little plant together to grade the grading and bagging and those kinds of things. The mover and the shaker behind that in that area got cancer after about 3 years and wound up dying, and so that kind of, if you don't have that one pusher. The other area that we worked on pretty heavily was helped the mushroom growers. There was a group in Elkton that was producing the compost for growing mushrooms, and actually that worked out quite well. There were people who had really gotten into that business, and then internally the composting company had some internal problems with a couple of the people that were owners, and the product got hurt because of it, because they weren't paying attention. They were dealing more with some of their personal struggles. And if you don't have a good compost product in mushrooms, and you get a mushroom that gets a brown spot on it or something, it's okay to eat, but it doesn't look very good in the store, and you just can't do anything with them. So, but you learn a lot from those kinds of things. I mean, we probably learn more from the things that don't work out than we do from the things that do work out.
Does that translate later on to maybe helping people that not to make the mistakes? Not to make the mistakes.
It also, or how we can do things without making the same mistakes again. Then we did a lot of promotion of the ethanol industry and the concept of producer-owned ethanol. Worked with a lot of different groups to promote that notion. And of course, the first project that we saw wasn't actually ethanol even. It was soybeans. And worked a lot with that group. One of the things that East River had the vision to do early on was to help provide feasibility money. And that is the hardest money to come by because you're just checking to see if something's going to work or not. So we had a couple of ways we did our feasibility grants, we call them. If they studied a project and it didn't happen, it was a grant. They didn't have to worry about repaying it. If they studied a project and it happened and it was served by the rural electric, they didn't have to pay the money back. If they studied a project and it was built and it was served by another electric utility, then we did ask them to pay the money back. But, it was only after the project was going. But that initial money helped a lot of projects, and one of those was the soybean producers, Dakota ethanol. Ethanol we don't put any feasibility money into now because we kind of got the plan going, but we did in a number of those organizations. After the soybean plant got going, and as they were creating the fund for Dakota ethanol, one of the things we kept hearing out there was, I'm a 55 or 60-year-old farmer. I've got things, I've survived, I'm pretty well off, I'm not interested in taking a new risk, so I'm not going to invest in an ethanol plant. That was one side of the equation. The other side of the equation was, I'm a young farmer. I've just bought some land. I've just bought some equipment. I don't have $10,000 cash laying around that I can put into an ethanol plant. So we looked at how we might be able to incentivize that, and one of the ideas we came up with was to allow our members who had outstanding capital credits not to retire those capital credits, because we all have a rotation that we retire capital credits on, but to actually get some value out of that, using that as collateral for a zero-interest loan from the rural electric co-op. So to the extent that we had to go out and borrow money or didn't have that money invested somewhere else, it was a cost to East River as well as the local co-op, because we shared in that loan. We made about $3.5 million in loans to producers to invest in ethanol plants, Dakota being the first, Northern Lights being the second, Watertown being the third. By the time it got to Chancellor and some of the other projects, we didn't have to worry about it, because people, this was a proven idea. Others were, people were just doing well by then. And in fact, one thing we saw was the older fellows who said, I don't know if I want to take the risk, they were starting to make their investments now. And
there were a lot more of those than there were of the young guys.
Exactly. And the young guys were doing well enough. Dakota, they opened their doors, and in 6 months, they had a 50% of dividend, or 50% of investment dividend. So those guys that invested $10,000 got $5,000 back in 6 months. So they had money to go out and make their next investment. And, we're just ecstatic that that's how that worked out. And, certainly from an electrical side, that's been good for the co-ops. We don't serve all the ethanol plants, but we do serve, or will, by the end of 2007, the first part of 2008, we will serve 8 of the ethanol plants in South Dakota.
Currently 11?
There'll be 13 then.
13 then,
yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Because we'll have Millennium online, we'll have Aberdeen Energy online, and we'll have Meckling, the plant down in Missouri River Ethanol online.
Mm-hmm.
So then we will serve all 3 of those.
Okay.
Or our members will.
East River, is this kind of unique being involved in this kind of thing? I don't know that I haven't heard a lot about Rushmore, for example, being involved to the same extent.
No, it is very unique. It's not only unique in South Dakota, but it's pretty unique nationally. We just, in fact, on the 5th of December, had a web conference with co-ops all over the country who are now seeing ethanol move into their area. And we talked about a lot of these very things, about some of the things we had done. We've also talked about siting ethanol plants electrically. How do you prepare to serve an ethanol plant? We've done a lot of contract development for serving these loads, so we've been able to provide, in a generic basis, a generic way, what our contracts look like, so that others across the country could use those if they chose to. This is I think that opportunity is the father of a lot of innovation, and we've had this opportunity where others haven't, and it's just now starting to happen there. Rushmore, serving in western South Dakota, there hasn't been a lot of change from traditional agriculture out there, so they haven't had a lot of the opportunities that we've had to make these kinds of programs work and develop these kinds of things. But we're excited now nationally as we see this whole ethanol industry develop. The co-ops are well positioned to serve the ethanol plants with reliable electric power. We speak the same language as most of the people that are developing these facilities, at least to this point. Now we're seeing a lot of Wall Street stuff come in here, so we don't.
Then I guess gets to a question I have. Do you have a concern about the fact that you may be getting these plants to stay in the hands of producers as opposed to Wall Street investors?
It's a concern to me personally. I made a decision early on, and there's two, or at least two ways you can look at every sheet of paper. There's always two sides to every sheet of paper, but I made a conscious decision early on because of the level of promotion that I had been doing for this industry not to be an investor in a plant.
Yep.
Now, my reasoning for that is I didn't want people to think I was promoting something that was going to benefit me. Others have said to me, well, that's okay, but maybe you weren't willing to take the risk either. And you can, like I say, you can look at that however you want to. For me, it came down to I didn't want to be self-promoting. So I don't have an investment in any of these plants. As I look at what I see happening now, there, again, is two sides. One side is this is an opportunity for these guys to cash in on something that they made an investment in. And there's no doubt that's the case. I take a little longer-term view, I think, and I believe this industry is going to grow. It's going to be strong. It's going to be here for a long time. Mm-hmm. I think that I'd like to see the investor hang in there and take that return for a long time to come and maybe have a legacy to pass on to their kids. I'm not invested, so I'm just giving you my personal feeling here that I just hate to see the farmers take themselves out of the decision-making process of what happens to these plants. So if they go public with them, they may still own shares, but they are not going to be part of the decision-making process, and that's the concern I have.
Yeah. Do you think that this is, it really almost seems to me that this is one of the first situations I've seen that, of course, those of us in the progressive agriculture area have looked forward to for a long time, giving farmers actually a chance to have some control over their pricing and so on. And the development of ethanol plants has certainly done that, giving them an opportunity to both benefit from when prices are lower for corn, and then if prices go up like they are now, to benefit from the higher prices.
Right. Well, and again, that's the beauty of this type of investment is when corn prices are down, the ethanol plant's making more money. Yeah. When corn prices are up, the farmer's making more money. I mean, they can't lose on this. You sell your investment, you're kind of back to buying yourself a place in the line at the elevator because you're just going to take whatever anybody gives you. And I don't know, that just kind of concerns, that more than kind of concerns me. That concerns me a lot. But people are going to make their own decisions about how they're going to move forward. I know there are a group of plants in South Dakota that have said, at least at this point in time, they are going to remain in the hands of the farmers, and good for them. I think that's a good place to be. But I guess the other thing is many of our producers in South Dakota are invested in a multiple number of these plants, and so some of them may sell, and others that they're invested in won't, and so they'll hopefully be able to control some of their destiny. But I do talk to investors a lot about this, and a lot of the response I get is there's just too much money on the table right now to not cash in. Again, they have to make those decisions. And
what's the situation elsewhere in the country? Do you communicate with to find we hear about new plants going up elsewhere? Are those largely farmer-owned or largely investor-owned facilities?
Those that are being built right now and coming online, a lot of those are farmer-owned. Those that we're hearing new plans and stuff, most of those aren't. Yeah. And what's happening is there's about a half a dozen or so large investment groups like U.S. Bioenergies out of Brookings, not Verisun so much because Verisun builds their own plants. But U.S. Bioenergies, for example, and there are some others out there like that.
Williams are building some plants off in Ohio.
Right, and a lot of those are groups of investors like U.S. Bioenergy that simply, they may go out and start to do a farmer drive, and this happened in Hankinson, North Dakota, for example. They were looking at doing a farmer-owned plant, and were beginning their drive, and U.S. Bioenergy came up and said to those who were putting the project together, the 4 or 5 or 6 people, look, we'll give you an opportunity to buy in, but we'll just take this whole thing, and you won't, we can just get it done right now. You don't have to go out on a drive, and they did it.
And the profit will be going away from them.
Well, it will be to a certain degree. It certainly will be, and we've definitely seen growth and wealth in this area because the farmers own those plants. There's a lot of smiling people around here.
And anytime a new plant starts up, it doesn't take but an hour or so to get enough investors to complete it.
Yeah.
People who've invested in other things already.
As we looked at the Aberdeen Energy and Missouri Energy ethanol plants, the one that west of Aberdeen and the one down by Meckling, both being built by Glacial Lakes, they $98 million in 4 meetings, and they raised it all. $98 million. That's a lot of money.
Yep.
So,
of course, it's probably some of that is maybe, would that be money that has already come back from people who invested in other ethanol plants?
There's no question about it. No question. But I think both of those had new investors, too, that saw what's going on. And But I'm on the board of directors of the American Coalition for Ethanol, or ACE. And at our annual conference this year, we incorporated in 1987, and I was one of the original incorporators of ACE. And we had our first annual meeting in Moorhead, Minnesota in 1987, and probably had 25, 30 people there. I don't know. It was cold and ugly, and we had our last annual meeting which is our 19th annual meeting in Kansas City this last summer. We had over 1,200 participants, and we had to cut booth registration off for vendors at 175 booths. We had a lot more requests than that, but that was all the space we had. The newest faces that were there this year that we have never seen before, certainly we always had CoBank and the Farm Credit System at our meetings and having booths, but we had lots of Wall Street type bankers at our meeting this year because they're very interested in what's happening in this industry. And the one bellwether that we have, certainly have ADM, but they're involved in so many different things. If you're looking at a bellwether that's strictly ethanol, Verasun is probably the one bellwether that's out there in terms of being a publicly traded company now. They opened at like 22, and I think got somewhere between 28 and 30, and then they dropped back to 16. But they were doing, and still are doing, a lot of capital investment, and a lot of their return is going into their capital investment. They're building 2 new plants right now, and just have 2 plants on in the last year, so they've got a lot of capital going into the ground. Their stock is now back up in that 20 to 22 area and seems to be settled out there pretty well. So, that's a company that's showing some good return. I think when they went down, it kind of caused a little slowdown in the Wall Street interest, but now that that's gone back up, I think Wall Street's getting interested in this business and industry again. Again, that scares me a little bit in that the market, as we see lately, is so fickle. I mean, it's up and down, and somebody sneezes and the market changes, and is that where we want our future energy supply to be resting? I don't know.
It seems, as I look at prices right now, it seems like the ethanol plants have actually also assisted the wheat producers, because there's less acres being planted of wheat and probably a higher price now.
The question always comes about, can we produce enough corn to provide for the ethanol plants?
How many rows of is it in South Dakota now? Is it 3, or is it all of it?
No. It's about 50%, a little over 50%. It used to be, it used to be 1 in 4, and now we're getting. I think when these plants that are under construction now will be just a little over every other row. But we are producers. That's what we do, and we will produce corn. We just will.
Every year won't be a drought.
Every year won't be a drought. And in fact, I was listening to Monsanto the other day, and their stated goals are that the average corn crop in the United States by 2009 will be 170 bushel dry land. But genetics today are just, we had one of the driest years that we've had this year all over South Dakota. It wasn't quite as dry right here along the I-29 corridor, but we were dry. And we had 150 and 60 bushel corn this year in a drought year. So, we're just seeing a lot of changes out there. A lot of corn is being bred now to have a starch that's easier to break down in the ethanol process, so we're seeing corn bred actually for that industry. We are going to have cellulosic advancements. There's no question about that. I think probably as much as switchgrass or those types of things, we will use the whole corn stalk and ear that will just be chopped and moved through the facility. The thing you lose, as we go to cellulosic ethanol, is we lose the good feed byproduct that we get out of our current process.
Probably a bit of a detriment.
It could be. It could be. I mean, certainly we're going to have feed, so we'll need corn to do that. But it's, corn is a 12 to 16% protein product, and the distiller's dried grain is a 30 to 32% protein. From the standpoint of feeding cattle, not for finish, but for growth, I mean, that's an excellent product. From the standpoint of a dairy, it's an excellent product because the protein is what they're looking for.
Yeah, has there been any more discussion of course, we had the value-added proposal to build a feedlot right next to an ethanol operation so that you could kind of create a circular operation. It seems to me like I've heard some talk of something like that going up in Indiana, even though we couldn't get it done here in South Dakota.
Well, actually, they did get one done in Nebraska.
They did.
And it is done, and it is operating. What that has done is that has rejuvenated, and the same people that were in South Dakota did that. That has reignited discussions in South Dakota, generally in the same geographic area, but not specifically in the same geographic area. One of the challenges that they had, where they were looking at siting it, was even though they're going to generate gas through the methane process, they still needed natural gas on site, and they were a long way from gas, and it was going to cost them a lot of money to get it there. My understanding is that group, the South Dakotans plus those who are in Nebraska now, have come back together and are seriously looking at that opportunity, and I think those things are going to happen. Part of the web conference we had the other day on ethanol, Sunflower G&T Cooperative, kind of a sister cooperative of ours down in Kansas, is working with a group. They are going to have an ethanol plant. Now, this is all going to be integrated into one. A feedlot with a digester, ethanol plant. You take the glycerin from the ethanol, that is a byproduct that really has no value right now. You mix part of that with the manure from the feedlot and the digester. It accelerates the biodegrading process, creates more gas, better gas. Then they are going to incorporate a biodiesel facility, maybe using some soybean, and they're going to also incorporate that with a power plant, and they will take the CO2 off of a power plant, and this is something new I learned the other day. It's always a great day when you learn something new. And the glycerin, and that together creates an algae. Algae has a lot of very high quality oil in it. I didn't know algae had oil in it. So that becomes then part of the biodiesel refining process. You take this algae and put it through the biodiesel refinery, and you pull the oil off of that. So this is really an interesting integrated system where they will have feedlot, digester, ethanol, biodiesel, power plant, all in a circular, because obviously the power plant's going to need to be there to provide the energy for these different components, steam for the processing. The gas will be used to dry grain, to heat water. I mean, it's going to be and they're quite a ways down the road on the development of this in northern Kansas. So. Okay,
that's so it kind of answers the old question about if we can go to the moon, we can do this.
We probably do this, yeah. So there certainly are going to be bumps in the road along the way. There's always bumps in the road, but I think they're gonna get that done. And that was really an interesting part of that whole discussion the other day. Very exciting, I think.
I suppose bottom line, maybe as much as we hate $2 or $2.50 gas, maybe that was necessary to encourage these kind of developments, that if we still had 50 cent a gallon gas, never would have happened.
Right. And as the rest of the world is developing, with China and India wanting to become 21st century nations, their demand for transportation fuel is just going to increase. And I think China, they're very interested in ethanol. in fact, are investing in some U.S. ethanol, I think, to get technology. And they have an insatiable appetite for transportation fuels, and that appetite is just going to continue to grow. So the world energy picture is probably not going to get cheaper. I think we need to come to grips in this country with conservation, particularly in the liquid fuels motor transportation area. As much as I love driving a big vehicle, I don't know how much longer we can sustain that. And I mean, certainly we could do that forever, I guess, if you want to pay the price. I don't know how good of stewardship that is from a world perspective in a limited amount of oil that's available. You know, people keep saying the ethanol bubble is going to burst, and the ethanol, how much can the market handle? Well, my answer to that is the ethanol bubble is only going to burst if we don't have the will to keep it going forward, because this is just a matter of will. This is not a matter of technology. We know how to do this. Do we want to be less dependent on foreign oil? I don't think we'll ever be totally self-sufficient. I don't think that's the way the world is made up today. I don't know that would be good for the world necessarily, that we would be totally self-sufficient. As far as how much can the market stand, we're less than 1% of the U.S. liquid fuels transportation market today. So I don't think we should worry too much about flooding the market yet, but there's a lot of room in the market. What I would really like to see us do now is we look at the 2007 Farm Bill, and it's supposed to be an energy component of that Farm Bill, is that we would start to think about not E10 and E85, but the use of ethanol at different levels throughout the fuel mix.
A blender pump.
A blender pump is exactly right, and that the reason for that is, in order to deploy E85 in a widespread area, what we are asking stations to do is to put another tank in the ground, or take a tank that they're using for something else right now, and put a blend of 85% ethanol and 15% unleaded gas in that. We're also asking them to take a tank and put a blend of E10 and unleaded gas in. We're also asking them to have a tank of unleaded gas, 87 octane, and if they choose to offer a premium, to have a premium tank. So now we got 4 tanks in the ground that they have to take space. They have to have different pumps on the islands. They have to worry about leaks. With a blender's pump, you put a tank of ethanol on the ground, and you put a tank of unleaded gas on the ground, and you're done. And you have a blender's pump. You give the consumer the choice about what they want to do. We go to the auto industry, and certainly it's not going to be you and I that go to the auto industry. The government is going to have to be involved in this and say, look, auto industry, we're going to help you with your CAFE standards if you'll certify cars at 20 and 30% E20, E30, E85. We don't think everything has to be flex fuel vehicles. There's no science behind E10. The only reason we have E10 is because we thought that's how much of the petroleum market we could get was 10%. E85 is still today classified as an experimental fuel. That's why we have that. That's why we're able to have that market. So I think from a distribution standpoint, if we can incentivize stations to put blenders pumps in, they don't have to have as many tanks in the ground. If we can incentivize the auto industry by letting them count this towards some of their CAFE standards, we can get them to participate with this. There is no question that we can do better with very little adjustment in the 85 fuel economy, that we don't have to get 10 to 15% less fuel economy with the 85. I mean, there's just no, I can't give you the technical information, but I have heard it, and I'm convinced that that's not that's not like putting somebody on the moon. It's a lot simpler than that. We do these things, and I think we'll get people to be willing to distribute. But think if we could just do 25% blends and reduce our oil needs from outside this country by 25%. I mean, just think about that.
What do you make of this recent kind of a blip that, who do you think was behind suggesting to those few stations that had blender pumps that they might be violating rules or something?
Well, I think that was the oil industry. There's no question about that. And now we've got the situation. It was a good ruling in terms of flex fuel vehicles and actually being able to have that pump there. The one statement within the ruling was kind of a negative deal where the comment was made, but if you as a station offer blenders pumps and somebody who doesn't have a flex fuel vehicle uses it, you could have some liability. Well, I mean, again, a consumer needs to have some responsibility here. It's not like you're saying you only have 20 or 30% opportunities. Certainly 10 is available and 0 is available.
Isn't this a replay of the kind of stuff we went through 25 years ago when so-called gasohol was first showing up at the pump, the people complaining that it was going to damage their engines?
Yeah. And the big yellow, orange, fluorescent orange signs we had, no alcohol in our gas. And, we've fought all this stuff, and ethanol's had an history of, we got to hit the ball and drag everybody else along and hit the ball and drag everybody else along. But thank God for people like Ori Swayze, Merle Anderson from Minnesota, Owen Jones from up at Britain, who are not willing to say, oh, okay, we'll just quit. I mean, these guys are the guys who have been in the trenches and been in these vineyards for a long, long time laboring to see the fruits of what we now see. And they keep pushing. There are people who get aggravated with them because they say, when is enough enough? And for these guys, enough is never enough until we're there. And they don't know when we're there. They don't know what that looks like. They probably will when we get there. But as far as they're concerned, we aren't there yet, and they're going to keep pushing us, and they should keep pushing us because we need to have people like Merle and Ori and Owen who say, we can't just stop now and sit on our laurels. We've got to keep going with this in order to reach the full value, the full maturation of this whole industry and this whole scheme of things in terms of use of fuels in this country. And ethanol is going to play a huge part in that in the future.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back a little bit. In fact, let's go back to the beginning. How difficult was it to convince the board members of East River to make this step that nobody else had done at that point?
Well, I wasn't here at the time they made the first step because I was hired as a result of that step. Yeah. But there are, as in every industry, there are visionaries who see things a long way down the road. And in this organization, Lauren Zangmark, I believe Lauren started to see this vision, and then he retired, and that mantle was picked up right away by Bob Farragon. And Bob really saw the vision of what could happen in a role that the rural electrics could play in economic development, and that we should. I mean, we should be there. This is something we should be doing. As cooperatives, we were part of the people and owned by the people, and we should be helping them. That's our mission. And he was supported by guys like Jeff Nelson and Virgil Fodness, the president of East River's board at that time. And that generation of board members that made this step were the first generation after the board members after their fathers who had the vision to start the rural electric program. And they remembered that. They remembered the neighbor coming down and saying, give me $5, we're going to bring you lights in your house. And they remember when that light came on.
Yeah.
And having seen all that, they knew that they could help with the next step, and that is the ethanol industries of the world, the value addeds, the things that are going to keep this economy in this part of the world alive. So, there were some that I'm sure were a little skeptical, and probably are today, some that wonder why we're doing that. But by and large, this is what co-ops are all about.
Mm-hmm. Another area that we've had to deal with over the years, probably more so a while back than today anymore, is the question of maintaining some sort of an incentive program through the South Dakota State Legislature and not always dealing with friendly governors on that issue. Want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's been one that's...
not so key today as it was maybe 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, you'll never hear me say that.
Okay. Okay.
I always agree with Ori Swayze on this issue. We don't have a tax break. Mm-hmm. We pay, the other guys pay an extra tax because they sell a dirty fuel. We sell a clean product that doesn't require the cleanup and doesn't require the things. We are not subsidizing an industry. We are incentivizing an industry. And I know those are just words, but words are also, your attitude is the product of the words that you use. And I think attitude is everything when you're trying to develop something like this. And if you have an attitude that this is good for all of us and that we should all support this, then I think you wind up with incentives like we have.
Yeah, and it's our South Dakota industry as opposed to somebody else's.
Exactly. We're not, and to the degree that we continue to produce more ethanol in South Dakota, we're not giving our 2-cent tax incentive away to anyone either. Mm-hmm. And the beauty of the 2-cent pump incentive, at least in eastern South Dakota, that is almost always passed on to the consumer. I mean, once in a while you'll see a station where ethanol may be the same price as unleaded, but generally, by and large, that's passed on. And that's a value to the consumer out there. From the plant's standpoint, even though the farmers are making good money on their corn they're selling right now, that does depress ethanol prices. So to the extent that depresses ethanol prices in that first 10 years of that plant, to give that kind of financial assistance, to a 50, 60 million gallon plant, to give them $10 million a year, or $1 million a year, isn't a whole lot of money. And we may not even give them $1 million if we don't have it. All we say is that you get $1 million a year for 10 years, or $10 million is what you're going to get. And that might take 12 or 13 years if we don't have the million to give in that year. Mm-hmm. So again, we're trying, when the part of that money comes from the petroleum cleanup fund, and if you have an ethanol leak, guess what? You don't have petroleum cleanup. You don't have to go out and do that because it dissipates into the soil and it doesn't cause harmful after effects. So again, we're incentivizing an industry, and we're recognizing the value that has to not cost us more money in the future.
Okay. Of course, we've had to deal with some opponents. You talked about some of the heroes, some of the people who've done heroic work, really, in promoting ethanol. Do you want to put any names on any of the people who maybe haven't done so much and maybe have been on the other side?
Well, I think it's the biggest group is a nameless group, and that's the oil industry. Yeah. And I did have an oil executive tell me one time that the big problem they have with ethanol is not the product. They understand the product's a good thing, not even getting it into the system, because they can do that. We've seen that through the blender's pump. Yeah. They don't like giving up 10% of their market for sure, but there are ways they can spend that to help in the environmental issues and stuff. But when they do oil, they own the well, they own the refinery, and in many cases they own the station. Yeah. They do not control the source of ethanol, and that's the corn. Yeah. They do not control the land or the farmer, and that's what scares them about it. They don't like it when they don't control the source. Mm-hmm. So that's one obstacle. Certainly in the legislature, we've had people who have said, they're strict free enterprise folks who say it's going to make it or it's not going to make it. Yeah. The problem with that attitude, in my opinion, is we don't have oil, or we don't have some of these other natural resources that can stimulate our economy. So if we're going to make an energy part of our economy, then we need to look at ways to incentivize that. Now, you don't hear that much anymore. In fact, what struck me in this last election, every statewide candidate that I heard talk about their role in South Dakota, or the local senators and representatives, talked about South Dakota as an energy state. I mean, when did we ever talk about ourselves as an energy? I mean, Texas, Oklahoma,
A handful of oil wells
Kansas,
in County didn't make us an energy
Kansas, part of North Dakota. I mean, those were talked about as the energy states, but not South Dakota.
Yeah.
Now we are an energy state. We're going to have over 1 billion gallons of ethanol by 2008. Wind energy, it's been a little slow to develop, but it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Methane, I mean, those different things. We just got, it's fun to listen to people talk about us being an energy state. And so in the beginning, there were a lot of people who didn't catch that vision. And I'm not saying that I had a vision that we were going to be where we are today, but I knew there was something out there, and a lot of people knew that a lot better than I did. Probably one of the fun parts about this, and I will use his name because it was just so much fun to watch him change. Gordon Peterson from Wall, just when we started trying to, after Governor Janklow took the incentive away, and we were trying to find a new place for that to be housed, he was one of our arch rivals on that. And part of that had to do with where we wanted to get the money, but it just conceptually he didn't like it. We spent a lot of time, and I give Jeff Fox a lot of credit for this. Jeff was the corn growers lobbyist at that time, now works for Broin. I watched Gordon Peterson go from absolutely no, this is a bad idea, to actually being one of our best supporters. I watched him walk from the House to the Senate to go on the Senate floor to convince some folks that they needed to vote for the bill that had come out of the House, and that was a lot of fun to see that.
Yeah, because he was a guy who didn't change his mind on things very easily.
Very easily, yeah. And Gordon is he's just it's just fun to talk about those things now, even with him, and we had some good challenges at that time. Governor Mickelson was the first governor to sign a proclamation saying that all vehicles will use E10 at that time. Mm-hmm. I must say our current governor, we'll see what happens this time. As a candidate, he was very, when he first ran 4 years ago, was very open about not supporting or not liking the idea of having to subsidize, in his words, subsidize the ethanol industry. In fact, there were 13 Democrat and Republican candidates who were running in the primary in 2002, and the corn growers and ACE had a political forum. We had all 13 of them there and went down the line. What do you think of the incentives for ethanol industry? And he happened to be the last person in line, and every one of them expounded about the value of the incentives. And we got to Governor Rounds, and he said, I don't agree with incentivizing things like this. He hasn't gone after them, and that's the good thing. I guess that's the good thing.
It's kind of interesting that some of the folks that had that attitude didn't seem to have that attitude about the state spending some money to promote tourism.
We've always had that contradiction, I think, in our
they
thinking.
Never called that subsidization
right,
or anything.
Right. That's economic development. But again, the governor did not do anything to harm us, and he, in this last campaign, spoke very highly of ethanol. In fact, one might think he started the industry in South Dakota. So we'll see how that translates into.
Okay. And there have been some other efforts that in the state that East River was heavily involved in getting going, and one of them was the Beetle and Spink Economic Community. Mm-hmm. They seem to be still doing very well with a grant that they had received from during the Clinton administration.
Yeah. It was the Spink, Beetle, and Day, actually part of Day County, an enterprise zone, because of outmigration and low income and population demographics. And we were able to work with that group to basically help them identify some of the opportunities they had, do some of the survey work to put the application together, and they were awarded an enterprise zone.
Those applications are rather complex.
Yeah, Linda Salmonson did a wonderful job there, and of course we also, about that time, were developing the REED Fund, the Rural Electric Economic Development Fund. Again, Linda Yeoman's work in putting that together. That fund started out with $2 million, and the idea was a small revolving loan fund. Our bylaws said that we would not be more than 50% of a project, and the maximum amount we'd lend to any one project was $150,000. Today, we still want partners, and we still generally don't look at being more than 50% because we feel it's valuable to have a number of people involved in projects. We have about $10 million loans out there. Our fund is growing from $2 million in assets to about $17.5 million in assets. We've made, because of the revolving nature, about $25 million in loans. So it's, we think, been a very successful venture. We've also been able then to take some of the proceeds from that and invest in Prairie Gold, which is an equity investment company that just got started and did a $10 million offering about 2 years ago. They have invested that $10 million now in several projects that are beneficial to South Dakota. They are now out for their second round and probably going to look at a bigger fund on the second time around. And I don't know if Reed will participate in that or not. We haven't seen the prospectus yet. They aren't quite ready to ask, but we certainly will give that good consideration. So that's been a little different twist. We've done a lot of lending with interest attached and collateral and stuff. We've stepped now ever so gently into the equity investment side of the world, where you're taking a lot more risk, but certainly the return could be higher, and help to continue to vitalize our loan fund and enhance that. So,
let's talk a little bit about the establishment of the Center for Value Added Agriculture. Is that the full?
Yep, the Value Added Agricultural Center. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That was a Jeff Nelson vision. Jeff really felt that there was a need in the state to have a place where these kinds of value-added projects could go, get juried, maybe in some cases if they needed, couldn't afford full-time accounting and bookkeeping services or those kinds of things, that could be offered through the Value-Added Center for a period of time as they got going. Just to be a conduit to others like us who may be able to have things through the Reed Fund, and a place where people who's got a good idea but they just don't know where to go. And we called a meeting with the Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, corn growers, wheat growers, barley growers, rural electrics, about any commodity group or rural group we could come up with, and presented this concept. And as very often happens in South Dakota, everybody said, this is a heck of a good idea. We grabbed our own bootstraps and we pulled ourselves up with the bootstraps, and everybody made a contribution to the Value Added Center. We were able to hire staff through the generosity of people like Farmers Union. We found office space for a period of time, and we're able to move forward with the Value Added Center. We're on our third exec right now, which actually I think the Value Added Center has been in place for 10 or 12 years. That's not too bad for a place like that. The good thing is every one of the former execs has gone on to something bigger and better, and that center continues to do well. We've actually received a couple of cooperative development grants from USDA, which helps keep that facility going. Most all of the original investors have stayed with the Value Added Center project to keep it going. Had some failures, and once again, those are good things because we've learned a lot from some of those things that we thought were going to work out that didn't. We've actually helped a lot of projects get going and find the right direction and become reality. And probably one of the biggest of those is the turkey processing facility in Huron. I can't say the name of what we call it now. We don't call it turkey processing. We call it Dakota Provisions. Dakota Provisions is the name of it. Originally, that was something that the Value Added Center began. They went there first and started talking about, and as a result, we have a $40 million processing facility, a food processing facility in Huron, South Dakota. So. Yeah.
Was a partnership kind of with USDA Rural Development, as it became to be known, when Dallas Consider was running that operation?
Certainly, we worked with them a lot, and they helped us with. Actually, we applied for a couple of cooperative development grants before we got one, but we did have help. Dallas helped a lot with that, and then Dallas, when his tenure at Rural Development was over, became the director for a period of time. Amy Gales was the first director of the Cooperative Development Center. Amy came to us with just a long history of cooperative service. She had worked in the cooperative banking industry as well as the farm supply cooperative industry in Minnesota. And then Dallas, of course, with just his myriad of experience in Farmers Union, rural development, and those areas came in. And now our current director came out of the Department of Agriculture, or Department of Economic Development, I guess, actually.
We've gotten to my last page here. As you look at, as you look at the future, we've had a lot of successes. What seems like the biggest unrealized opportunity, what we haven't done that's still out there in front of us?
Well, I think feeding cattle. We just, we birth so many cattle in this state, and then we don't feed them out. And I think one of the visions with the ethanol industry has always been that we would increase the cattle feeding operations in South Dakota, because we have a good source of a very high quality feed product coming out of the ethanol plants. Yeah. We have seen a great growth, as you know, in the dairy industry, and they have been taking advantage of that ethanol industry with feed product there. But I think cattle growing, or cattle finishing cattle, unfortunately we don't have a cattle processing or beef processing really plant in South Dakota.
To get over.
Yeah, and that hurts us. I think that's probably the biggest unrealized. I think the future, though, is I don't know how we're going to do in cattle feeding, but I really think the future is bright in the area of genetics and using commodity products in the health world. I just think that there's a lot of research being done in corn oils and things like that, and a lot of that is coming to South Dakota because we have a good climate for that, and we have a lot of good raw products. And South Dakota State, I think, being a Division I school now, offers some opportunity there for research, grants, development. I see the Board of Regents yesterday is looking at a new molecular type doctoral program at South Dakota State, and those things will enhance that whole area of genetic growth and how we can use more of our products that we raise in the pharmaceutical industry. And I really think that's a huge opportunity that we have, the new frontier for what we're going to do in South Dakota. And I think that there's a lot of thought and activity going in that direction right now, and where we'd actually grow crops that would wind up in the pharmaceutical arena. So.
Mm-hmm. I've got one question. I'm going to go back to my first page about that I kind of skipped over at that time. And it's just a kind of a generic question. What was it that you liked about cooperatives? You've been working for the cooperative system for a long time as opposed to other kinds of businesses.
I was raised by a prairie populist. I mean, my father and my mother, I grew up going to Sioux Valley Energy's annual meetings, Sioux Valley Electric, we called it at that time, with the big tent. I grew up going to my local Farmers Elevator co-op meetings. When I was in high school, I worked for the Farmers Elevator in Brookings and White and Toronto. They owned all three of them, and I worked in the elevator. And I love the nonprofit world. My motivation in life goes towards helping people make their lives better, and it doesn't go towards the bottom line, and that's fine for people who do. We're all different, and that's the beauty of this world. But I just don't. I like spending my time trying to figure out how we can get things done and make them work, not just looking at the bottom line. Mm-hmm. And that's what the co-ops offer for me. And I often remind people that the only reason we exist as a cooperative is to provide electrical service to our owners as cheaply and as safely and as economically and as reliably as we can do it. And that's otherwise we don't have a purpose, because we're not trying to satisfy some investor from New York or L.A. or someplace remotely distant from where we are. We work for the people that own us. Yeah.
Looking back on your career up at this point, you still have a lot of career in front of you. Do you have role models that people you worked with that you really admired? And
Of course, we all have role models, and I'd say seriously, and this is kind of the emotional one. But my dad was. He was a guy who really lived what he talked about, and my mother as well. And they were just salt. They are. My mother is, and my dad was just salt of the earth people. And so I model a lot of what I do after him. But guys like Bob Farragon, guys like Virgil Fodness, Jeff Nelson. I mean, these folks are people that I look to and say, their hearts are in the right place. Their careers. Just are what I want to emulate my life after, and I think that's Bob Berglund is another guy that I got to know quite well when Bob was at NRECA, and just one of those guys that if you have to live like somebody, that's who you want to live like. So,
do you feel that today? That cooperative patrons, whether they're rural electric or otherwise, that they sometimes tend to take those cooperative institutions for granted because a lot of the people out there were not around when the cooperatives were established?
Well, certainly a different member out there today and different expectations than when they were established. I think I think in the beginning, some people took them for granted. But I think there are people out there who are also looking at, what more can my cooperative do? As a cooperative-owned business, what more can we do? And I tend to gravitate towards those people because that's what I'd like to see the attitude be. Certainly, there are always those who are patrons of co-ops who have a strong free enterprise bent, and they don't quite understand what cooperatives are about. In the electric world, they're patrons because they don't have a choice. Yeah. But in some areas, that's the only gas station in town, or that's the only filling station or service station or feed store or whatever. And people who aren't raised in that don't understand that, well, the reason that's the only one is because the people are doing it themselves.
Yeah. And, do you fear that perhaps, in some instances at least, we've seen situations where maybe the bottom line becomes more important than providing service, and that the idea of providing service kind of gets lost as the quest for a better net increases, not necessarily in the rural electrics, but perhaps in some of the other co-ops?
I don't think there's any question about that, and that's been one of the challenges for some co-ops and getting involved in the 85 and some of the other things that we're trying to do, like through the ethanol industry. Yeah. Well, if the bottom line isn't quite there, they don't want to do it.
Yeah, don't want to take any risks.
Yeah.
And how would they have ever been established if they'd not taken a risk to start with?
I mean, the visionaries, again, that went out and said, give me $5 and we'll bring some electricity to your house. Well, I'll tell you, $5 in 1929 and 30 and 31 and 32 and 35 and 38, 40, 41, that was a lot of money. And you're going to do what? Yep, we're going to build a line right down this road and we're going to bring you lights. And it's interesting because we have one county in South Dakota, Union County, that has Union Electric, Clay Union Electric, and formerly Lincoln Union Electric, which is now Southeastern. And one time I said, well, why do we have 3 co-ops in this one small county? And I don't even know this person, so I'm not making light of them or anything, but in the beginning, whoever the manager was of Union County, if all of the people that lived in a mile wouldn't sign up for electricity, he wouldn't provide electricity for anybody in that mile. Well, I take that back. If the first person would, he would. But if the fourth person on a mile, when they were coming in that direction, wanted it and the other 3 didn't, he wouldn't go down and serve that person. Well, the other 2 co-ops said, well, we'll serve you. I mean, that's what we're about. We know everybody else is going to get on board at some point in time. So that particular county that little county has 3 different co-ops in it. Again, because there wasn't the willingness to take even, I think, a very calculated risk, but to take no risk at that time. And, you look back at the people that started this program, they were true visionaries. I mean, that took a lot of courage to go to Washington and say, all right, you got this rural electrification program. You offered that to the investor-owned utilities that are in existence, and they didn't want to serve rural areas. We're farmers. We'll take that money and we'll serve ourselves. It's a miracle they didn't get laughed out of Washington when they asked that. I think it was only by the chance that it was the right administration and president there at the time that all happened. But then to come home and do it, I mean, that is tenacity and determination and vision, and I'd only hope to think we could do things like that today, and I think we are with the ethanol industry. I think that's a one example of people who said 10 years ago, this is too big a risk.
Yeah.
Some people were willing to step forward and take that risk, and now look what's happened.
Yeah,
So.
one of my favorite poems is the one that Bob Farragut wrote for the 50th anniversary of the Rural Electric.
Yeah. We had him read it at our annual meeting this year.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I just did a 35-minute video for the Oral History Association convention, and I finished it with the last minute or so of his 7-minute poem.
Well, that's what we did
beautiful,
too.
Beautiful finish.
Yeah. Did he read it, or did you read it?
Oh, he read it.
Yeah.
He read it. I had him read it.
Yeah.
I did one of my first interviews was with him, and I had him read the entire poem.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
I think a poem is always best when it's read by
the author. You bet. He can read it with the way he wrote it. And,
yeah. Just got a couple questions left. Challenges facing cooperatives have changed over the years. What seems like the biggest change to you?
Change?
Yeah.
The rapid growth. I mean, traditionally, rural electric cooperatives were looked at as serving rural areas, very methodical, a little bit of growth here, a little bit of growth there. We've got so much growth going on right now, it's just unbelievable. In 1975, the state legislature asked us to define territories between the investor-owned utilities and the rural electrics. Generally, the investor-owns took the towns, the rural electrics took the rural areas. Now we're seeing those towns grow beyond those original lines significantly, particularly in the Sioux Falls, all up and down the I-29 corridor. And so that is just causing us significant load growth, which means new facilities, new investments. So keeping up with that is going to be one of our big challenges.
Yeah. Even a little bit of growth out our way in Huron.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not isolated, and that is the interesting part about this. We're seeing certainly the Sioux Falls area growth, but we're seeing, we can hardly find a co-op now that we don't have an ethanol plant in or something of a large facility that we're serving. We're seeing growth everywhere. If the pipeline comes through, this Trans-Canada pipeline, that's going to be a significant investment and growth for us.
Yeah, and some discussion of a basin plant in South Dakota.
Yep.
One last question, and I think you've already answered this time and again, but are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Well, I'm very optimistic. I just, I think that the only reason that things won't work is because we just decide they're not going to work. And if we decide they're going to work, they're going to work. And, again, it's the whole philosophy upon which this program, the rural electric program, was built, is that we can do this ourselves, and we can serve ourselves, and we can build a good, strong foundation and a good, strong business. And that, because I like nonprofits, does not mean that we can't run this as a business. We have to meet a bottom line, and we do have to make good business decisions. I think this whole rural economy is at that point right now where we can make good business decisions like ethanol, like biodiesel, like dairy, and add things like digesters and things that are going to enhance or add value to what we're doing. There's just all kinds of opportunities out there. The whole notion of wind industry, we're going to, that's going to have some benefit at some point in time. It's just not quite there yet, but it's going to be part of what we're going to do in this whole region in terms of improving the economy out here. I guess what I'd like to see, the most optimistic I could be, is to see 20 new houses in Wessington Springs in the next 5 years or something, where these communities that we've seen a lot of out-migration, people moving back to those areas. So we got a lot of room out here.
There it is. All the way from the Canadian line to Texas and rural areas, there's a lot of space for people to live. Yeah. Is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you'd like to talk about?
Well, just, the partnership that we've had with the Farmers Union over the years has been invaluable. The Farmers Union is the same people that we serve. We've just worked so closely in all of these rural development areas and just the development of our business, that's been such a valuable partnership. But that's what rural America is made up of, is valuable partnerships like that. And if we don't have those, we're not going to succeed. And again, that's why I'm optimistic, because we got a lot of good, valuable partnerships out here. And sure, we disagree on some things, but we always come together in the end. It's the old, within the family we fight like cats and dogs, but if somebody comes and picks on one of us, we all rally around and take care of that. So.
Okay. We've been visiting with Scott Parsley. Thank you for participating in the Cooperative Legacy Project.